Hello, and welcome to this episode. Today, I am joined by my close friend and advisor in Covina, Angela. We're going to be talking all about rebirth, what it means to be born again, and to go into an extended period of reflection and study leading up to a rebirth ceremony. We're recording this on Friday, February the 11th. And in my school, the Covina Institute, we are getting ready to open up to welcome new members for our rebirth journey that starts on the next full moon and then goes through a new moon, a full moon, then the ritual itself on a new moon, and then we conclude on the following full moon. So several weeks exploring rebirth through psychological exercises, through crafting, magical crafting, working with different archetypes, including Anasa Eneroi, which is a title of Hecate, Persephone, and other goddesses that means death queen. And then ultimately, we work with the Kore archetype, which is the maiden reborn. So we explore rebirth as a whole journey. In the school, I teach a series of rituals based on the ancient, or I would say more inspired by the ancient Eleusinian mysteries that includes a ritual of release in autumn, a ritual of soul retrieval or reclaiming in winter, and in spring we do a rebirth ritual. So the actual date of the rebirth ritual, because in the school we follow a calendar that is both lunar and seasonal. So this year the date happens to fall on April the 1st, which is when we'll be doing the live ceremonial gathering. And typically in Covina, we're like what I call Covina casual most of the time, but we have these 3 rituals where we do kind of get very ceremonial and procedural about things. So that's an overview of the Covina kind of structure and how this works. And now, I should say, if you want to join Covina, you can go to keepingyourkeys.com and there's lots of different ways you can join Covina there. So now let's get into one of our favorite topics is the idea of psychospiritual, I guess, dismemberment and death and then rebirth. And that framework was certainly present in what we think was the mission of those who went to Eleusis for the ritual cycle that involved Demeter, Persephone, and Hecate Artemis. Um, so, and you and I have been talking about this for the last few days. Like, what do we want to bring to this episode? And for me, like as an applied social psychologist, I'm always like, what's the point? Like, why do we do this? And so I've been thinking about, so I've been teaching this rebirth ritual. This will be the 5th anniversary of doing it like in an online setting. And for me, the point of doing it from a psychological perspective is that when we focus our attention on a construct, like in a very practical way, it attunes us to like the meaning of the construct. And then in a deeper way, it attunes us to like the archetypal force of like the energy current of rebirth that flows through lots of different archetypes, whether it's the story of Persephone or one of your favorite stories, the tale of Inanna. So I love that story as well. And I really love the way you talk about it. So maybe you could talk a little bit about why that particular myth is so important to you.
I want to start by saying I think that there's a lot of anxiety about death in our culture, not just in terms of like the finality of life, but in terms of like losing things, this idea of some aspect or some version of us dying. Because I think that we really associate that with loss without taking into consideration that a loss creates space, and it's only with that kind of space that new things can happen. I'm really glad that you brought up the Eleusinian mysteries and Inanna, because for me these ideas are very connected. Inanna was the Sumerian goddess of love and creation and destruction. She's one of the oldest goddesses that we know of by name. And she's also tied to a lot of older goddesses that we don't know about. And she's tied to a quite ancient understanding that life and death were literally, from a god's perspective, sisters. So Inanna's sister is Ereshkigal, who's a kind of, she's not the Persephone of the story, but she is in terms of like, she rules the underworld. That's her domain. And Inanna has done something quite unpleasant to Ereshkigal. She's created conditions where Ereshkigal's husband, a holy bull, has died. And she's also pregnant. So Inanna has to go down into the underworld, where her sister doesn't super want to see her, actually. And to traverse the underworld, to get all the way to the place where her sister is, she has to cross this series of gates. And even though Inanna is a very powerful, super solar goddess in her own right, she's arguably like one of the most powerful goddesses in that particular pantheon, she's still subject to the rules of this space that's not her domain. So every time she traverses a gate, she has to leave something of hers behind. Or in some versions of the story, like things are actually stripped from her, pieces of armor, clothing, so that when she finally arrives at the end, she's totally naked. And this is how she has to appear for what's actually a quite harsh confrontation with her sister. She actually dies before she's reborn in this story. I just really, like, this story can seem very harsh. I think that a lot of Sumerian stories can seem quite difficult to us, but the Eleusinian mysteries, which basically is sort of like ritualize the story of the descent of Persephone, are kind of telling the same story. I think a lot of the versions that we tend to focus on are about how Hades essentially tricks Persephone into entering the underworld. But there are also other versions that say Gaia, the creation goddess, is the one who makes the decision that she would like Persephone to enter the underworld, and she's the one who plants the narcissus that Persephone picks. A lot of symbolism there already, like the maiden picking the narcissus flower before tumbling into the underworld. It merits saying here as well that Gaia, the goddess of creation, is also one of the first goddesses. So her parent is actually an elemental. Gaia is the child of chaos. So you already have this really interesting idea about how creation understands in a really clear way how critical chaos and disruption are to the creative spirit. So Persephone tumbles into the underworld. You know, she goes through all of her travails and she ultimately becomes queen of the underworld. But the Eleusinian mysteries are also about how that relationship that she develops with Hades, and the fact that she's there is what kind of seeds and germinates life. Like, you really require what is happening under the ground in order for life to thrive, for there to be life in the first place. And when the antique Greeks were engaging in these Eleusinian mysteries, they did it every year in order to remind themselves of that cyclical nature of existence. Like, life and death are with us side by side all the time. And this is something that we have to remember. It's not just our death that we have to think about, but aspects of us that need to die. And I think that this is something that we do quite nicely in Covina, also in a cyclical cycle that aligns with the seasons, when people are already naturally reflecting on aspects of themselves, you know, kind of toward the end of the year, that need to be released or that need to be retrieved and worked on during this time of like deep hibernation of winter. And then, you know, like we enter into rebirth when the sun starts to return to us, you know, and we have the energy to focus on, okay, now that there's space, who is this new creature that I'm designing that's going to interact with the world?
And like you said, in Eleusis, like they did this every year because but they did it like during a truncated period of time. The way I teach it, we stretch them out over autumn, winter, and spring, and then at the summer solstice, which is kind of our convocation, like the end of our academic year, we do this really kind of solar, beautiful celebration of all. We call it the sovereign goddess celebration. So we do a meditation and we celebrate like all of the faces of the goddess. But that, and that is to end the underworld journey. Like at Rebirth, we come out of the cave. So we use the symbolism of the cave, just like they used at Eleusis. You go down into the cave and then you eventually emerge. But for me, one of the questions I've always had, like from my own journey, and as like someone who develops these programs, that there's so much attention like focused on let's get to rebirth, let's become untamed, let's become liberated. In the school we're doing right now, the focus is Rixapile. So that's an epithet of Hecate and other goddesses that means chain breaker, gate crasher. So there's a lot of emphasis around let's get free, but there's not a lot of emphasis on what comes after you kind of reach this idea, this state of being where you feel like you were reborn. So whether it is like through a formal study program, or you're doing it on your own, or you're doing it with the Keeping Her Keys book, however you're doing it, that what comes after the book, the story, the movie usually ends when the heroine in the movie, she breaks out of the thing. Like it's not what comes after. So that's why we move into Kore, focusing on the wise maiden, the reborn maiden. So we're not Persephone before she ever went into her time with Pluto. We're the Persephone who comes out in the spring and who makes the world like fertile and verdant, and spreads goodwill basically, but has this enthusiasm, this enlivening factor, not only on herself but on the whole world. That when we are
sort
reborn,
this entering into pollinating action,
right? It is definitely entering into pollinating. So we're pollinating ourselves by being who we really are. And I do think, like Inanna or Persephone, we do need to be stripped clean. In shamanic kind of parlance, the idea of spiritual dismemberment and death is so symbolically powerful for us. Like, what are we stripping away? Like Inanna, like what are we stripping away? What are we setting down? What are we perhaps carrying that, if you've been in the school through the whole cycle and you've gone through like release and soul retrieval, and now you come to the gate of rebirth, like all that you've learned is going to give you that wise mind to know what needs to be set aside, what you need to bring death to. And it's interesting when we focus on Anassa Inaroi, the death queen, the death goddess, the death mother. And like what you said about how in our overly solar society, that conversations about death, like we have a lot of death resistance. We don't want to talk about it. And I certainly have this, but Carl Jung has a quote, and it's a great one. It says, "Death is not a failure, it's the goal."
Right? I like that.
It's a great quote because it completely changes the frame in which you see death. Like, death is not a fail. We all die. So it's the goal of our lives to die, and to die well.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so it's like within the context of doing this rebirth, it's like, how do we have the beautiful death?
Well,
to what we know, what no longer serves. Like, how do we do it with grace? And we're not hateful of perhaps relationships or ways we used to be. We're not hateful towards them, but we can
Yeah.
allow ourselves to lovingly let them go. So in the school, we're doing our crafting project is
Yeah.
we're making negative confessions caskets, and we're working with the idea of bringing death to what we're not by saying that we're not something, which is inspired by the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's our fun crafting. So we'll make little caskets with perhaps little poppets and fill them with roses, because rose is our botanical for the month.
Very Persephone.
Yeah, very Persephone. So we're getting that layer, because one of the things that our members love the most is that we do kind of bring it all together through crafting.
Yeah.
Like that sacred creativity is so important, I think, to really
Yeah.
dive deep into something like this that has so
Yeah.
many layers.
It also does good work, I think, toward demystifying these words that can sound kind of scary in a solar culture, like terms like death or even dismemberment. They create a lot of sort of morbid anxiety. And one of the things that I think really comes out quite nicely in the crafting and in the conversations that we have around the crafting is also this idea of how important that time of like being under the ground is, like not even just literally, but in all senses of the term. Like there are emotions that we kind of push down to a place that we can't hide. That we can hide them. Like we literally say we bury them. And like even from a psychological perspective, what we don't understand is when we bury these things that we don't want to deal with, they germinate in like the fertile earth of our souls and of our psyches, and they return to us as something else. Like at some point you are going to have to reckon with it again. So yeah, like I really appreciate this idea of like finding a way that's also creative to collaborate with that process and be really conscious about like, when you talk about like dying a good death, this idea of how to be a good ancestor, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love that. So what are we, while we're focused on this, multi-week rebirth journey or doing it on our own, like how is what we're doing in the here and now going to make us a better ancestor? Like what lineage are we creating by, getting our life in order, working on healing our past trauma? Maybe even part of the rebirth journey is to do like some ancestral healing, like we do in our premium course, Lympadia. We work with the empty chair technique and really dive into ancestral healing and talking to ancestors as part of the rebirth process.
Yeah.
Because part of what can need to be reborn is like we've got encoded even in our DNA, like not just in a energetic sense, but actually like physiologically, we can be carrying the trauma of previous generations. And I
Yes.
think facing Anassa Eneroi and these very kind of frightening concepts of the underworld, death and dismemberment, because it puts us in relation to the spirit of death. Like it brings up our own lineage, like our own heritage. So, there is this really like both nuanced and very complex experience when you really, in a sophisticated, committed way, enter into rebirth. And, and that's why we take so long with it in the school, because it is a very challenging concept right from the get-go. Rebirth requires bringing death to something.
Yes.
And, although, here in 2022, we don't maybe do something traditional like they've done in cultures and in Eleusis, is that, we have our acolytes. We don't actually have our acolytes go and sacrifice a living thing. But I mean, in the past, that is always how people were really initiated into what rebirth meant, is that the whole series started by having to bring death to something, like to make an animal sacrifice. But we do it symbolically through crafting.
Yeah.
And
And
you know, like so we get into that energy, but you don't have to physically bring death to something. Though, although I really, and we do this in Lympadia in the premium course, you know, like encourage them to explore like death in the natural world around them in whatever way is comfortable for them, because I think that is one of the more like accessible ways to really connect to the spirit of rebirth. Like if you are in a place where, you know, you can see even like dead insects, you know, this idea that the dead insect goes back to the earth, like that all that dies must be reborn, that this is, and to me, this is the spirit of like Hecate as this archetypal primordial world soul force, that the, you know, like it's like the will of that force is this cycle that is the wheel. And I think that's why Hecate's wheel, the Strophalos, appeals to so many people on this kind of deep, intuitive, transcendent level. It's because that wheel, like it has that connected to it, that all is spinning and always changing. And even though all things must die to be reborn, that will be repeated again. Like it's not that you do this once and it's over. It's like this is us attuning to the natural rhythm of the universe. Which is
yeah, I'm really sorry. Please
no, no, I
continue.
was just gonna say, and for me, I need I need several weeks to be in
Yeah, it's
company
really
with this.
tough.
And as as an educator, um, you know, I want my students and my members to have several weeks to explore these concepts in a deeply meaningful way so that it leads to lasting change. Because we know from psychological research that for us to truly change, although in a spiritual sense, sometimes one ritual does it for us, but in a
Hmm.
pragmatic, everyday sense, to be able to bring that into the world so our lives do actually change in like the waking world, like we need several weeks. We need a minimum of 6 weeks.
Yeah, you need to feel yourself plugging into a cycle of time. I'm really glad that you brought up the wheel. Like there are a couple of things that I want to talk about here. Like I do think that it's important for us to talk about like the ways in which like that you've chosen these particular rituals, not just to sort of like open toward like things that we need to retrieve and like things that we need to let go of, but also like putting these things into action. But before we get to that, like there's something really interesting about the principle of the wheel, because while you were talking, I realized this is actually a very subversive idea, like the notion of us living in a cycle, like, you know, in a bunch of like interconnected systems that move on seasonal circular cycles is an ancient idea. Like I think it's not very controversial to say it's one of the oldest ideas that we've had. Like we've lived them in our bodies since I don't know, since the beginning of all living things. But there's a culturally, we're very much in this culture where the dominant story is the hero's journey, right? It's a story of endless ascension. Maybe there's like a little blip in the middle where like you go down and have a few hard knocks, but like the principle is endless ascension. And I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with the digital editor of Dark Mountain, Charlotte Duquesne, who said the interesting thing about these quite old myths about women specifically, you know, in contrast to the hero's journey, is that women seem to always need to go down. And those downward journeys are a couple of things. One, they're community oriented, like there's always this need to traverse the underworld alone, like you're doing it alone, but you're also getting a lot of help. Like you're not going to survive it without the help of other people who say, oh, by the way, like this is how you have to do this, and make sure you feed Cerberus and don't eat the food. Like, you know, there's always somebody like giving you a hot tip. So there's like a community aspect to this. But there's also the circular aspect, this idea of in order to achieve transformation, it's not a matter of constant ascension. It's a matter of knowing that you're going to have to go down again and again and again in a cycle. And this also kind of reminds me of, you know, do you want to talk about the running maiden? Because I know that like you're very attached to this image. of the
I
running
am
maiden?
very attached to this little figure. So this is a figure that was excavated from Eleusis, and I've never seen it in person. And I hope to one day see it in person. So it's a little figure, think of like a little doll, made of stone, and it's sometimes attributed to being Hecate, but also Artemis. And I think in terms of like discussing Hecate, it's important for us, like from an academic perspective, just to briefly say Hecate and Artemis are often intertwined, and it's difficult for academicians to even suss out sometimes, if the person, if the source material saw them as separate and who's actually being discussed. So Artemis, the Olympic Artemis that a lot of us love, this chaste maiden with her deer and arrow, that's one version of Artemis from the antique world. But there's the other version of Artemis where she is very much like a great mother figure as well. So Artemis had a variety of understandings beyond the Olympic Artemis. But the running maiden actually kind of looks like the Olympic Artemis, that she's this younger figure. And sometimes, a scholar will say it's Hecate, and other times they'll say it's Artemis. It doesn't really matter. But it's this maiden who is either running from something in Eleusis or running to something in Eleusis. And why this really enchants me, it's because it is so much like the perspective that we have, how we experience this little figure. Like, is she running from something in fear, or is she running towards like the rebirth component? And is she one of the little, like a Mistai figure? The Mistai were like the attendants who would see, the officiants who would see people through the Eleusis cycle. So what is her role? And I mean, there's no way to know for sure what this little figurine represented, but to me, when I was developing, that premium initiatory course, Lampadia, I was studying this little figure. I was trying to find all these different like photographs of this figure. And it occurred to me one day, like that is what the whole ritual cycle and what rebirth on its own, what it does is like so many of us, I think particularly women, we spend all of our time running from something, like trying, like avoiding something. And we go from running from our lives, from our problems, to running towards like our life that we're designing for ourselves. So to me, this is the running maiden is an example of, like, I guess the two pillars. If you think of the classic Taro high priestess who has those two pillars on either side, I forget what the letters stand for. Do you remember right now? She has those
I
letters.
know that it's a B and a J, but I don't remember what they stand for. Yeah, I always think about blowjobs. That's why I remember. I'm just like, oh, that's unfortunate that it's a B and a J.
But it's Bina, and they're Kabbalistic, I believe, though I could.
Yeah.
But for me, when I look, like those two pillars around the high priestess are like approach and avoidance, because in terms of like general ways we operate always, whether it's doing deeper work, magic, or just in our everyday lives, we're always in company with approaching and avoiding. So those are the two pillars of the high priestess card in the terms of like how I teach things. I should come up with fancy Latin names for them. Like, it would sound so much better. Anyway, I'm sure we will come up with fancy lessons. And like in the high priestess of the temple of good enough, we can have things that have very plain, straightforward labels. It's fine.
Let's call them BJs for now.
We'll call them BJs. AAs.
Let's not actually call them BJs.
We're gonna make the BJs into AAs. Approach, avoid. And like I think, like, I'm sorry, we're kidding. Okay, let's bring it back. Let's just take a moment. We're gonna bring it back. We didn't like the candle at the beginning, and this is what happens when we don't like the candle and get our energy sorted.
That's silly.
It's true. Okay. Okay. So that running maiden is kind of like, she's emblematic, I think, of the difference in our lives when we go through a period of focus, like study and transcendent experiences, that we become the one who is running to, and not, we're not trying to escape our lives. We're trying to like move towards what we feel is so true to us and our soul, and
Like
making
the
that,
active collaborators in our lives, designers of our lives.
not running from it. And it doesn't mean that life is going to be, like problem free. This isn't like some like unicorn miracle that's happening. It's about fundamentally transforming like who we are in a way that allows us to bring the best of who we are to the situation, and to be really gentle and kind with ourselves,
Yeah.
so that we can be that way with others. The three keys like of my work are passion, kindness, and integrity, and really to get in relation to what those are as like energetic forces in the world. Like, where is my passion, my eros, my desire?
Yes.
How can I be kinder to myself? And how can I do this with, integrity, with grace and mercy for myself and others? And, for me, like working with these spirits, egregores, in a deeper sense, and also in an applied practical sense, it creates a life like that's a tableau where kind of the more everyday problems, we become more competent, at paying the bills, at
Yeah.
finding a job that serves us well, of developing a strong, nourishing relationship with our partners. Like, we need to get at the structure, the scaffolding, rather than just always talking about the problem.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought this up, because like, like you've brought up all of these sorts of like everyday quotidian examples, and I think that one of the important aspects of the seasonal cycle, and one of the ways in which it applies directly to our lives, is that once you start associating like yourself with this idea of a seasonal cycle, of yourself but also of all things, you really stop associating any negative event that happens in your life as a sort of like ultimatum kind of failure. Like, I think that there's a lot of that in our culture as well. Like, well, you could have done this better, you didn't do this right, and there's this very strong feeling of you did not optimize well enough, so you have failed, and that's a very discouraging idea. And I also wanted to touch upon just the beauty of the running maiden icon, and this very simple principle of like running from versus running to, because it's such a useful shorthand for thinking about this idea of I think in a growth-oriented culture, it's already quite subversive to think about the things that have hurt you. Like, it's really important to sort of consider your traumas and sort of the defenses that helped you design your personality when you were a child, because those are things that you need to know about yourself to understand how you relate to others, and what triggers you, and also to understand how to make yourself more whole, to start healing those things, right? But I also think that quite often, and this is why the rebirth principle is so important, quite often we end up spending a lot of time there. Like, we can get stuck there, sort of stirring trauma around and not really knowing what to do next, kind of mistaking that stirring for curative action. And there is a moment when those things are not really very curative anymore. And what I like about the rebirth ritual, which we meet in the spring, and it's like the ritual before sovereign goddesses, is this idea of okay, you've done all this stuff, you've done all of this sort of like a digging into yourself and investigating this hard work of the winter, but you can't stay in the underworld. Like, that's the whole principle of like, don't eat the food, right? Like, don't stay there, don't choose to live there. How now do you go from running from to running to? How now do you begin taking proactive action in terms of filling this space that you've created with things that you actually, like you said, with things that you actually desire? Because when you start to move from rebirth to sovereign goddesses. You know, we were talking about how sovereign goddesses is very solar. It's kind of like, it's like the pinnacle of who you are in this high summer moment of the cycle. You can only arrive at that empowered place by beginning to take action and make really clear choices about what you want in your life and why. Like that's very much key to empowerment, is this idea of leaving the underworld and seizing that momentum in a conscious way, right?
I think that's so true. And I just want to like talk more about how you said in our solar culture, because maybe we should just define what we mean by solar culture, because you and I have been using that kind of jargon that a lot of people might not know, like what does that even mean, a solar culture?
Does that mean we worship God?
Yeah. What does that mean? So as kind of like, so if you think about the sun and the moon, and in archetypal psychology, the occult and so on, the sun and the moon have distinct signatures, which is basically like a personality profile. So, you know, it's like if the sun and the moon were on an online dating app, you know, what would be their list of qualities, their likes and dislikes, what, you know, like what would these things be? So that's called signatures. So solar signatures are generally associated with, and if you know astrology, your sun sign. So the sun sign is generally about like who you are to the exterior world.
How you present.
Right. In a psychological perspective, the solar is associated with our personas, like who we are in the world. Whereas the moon, the lunar, is associated more with the interior, and who we are on the insides. And generally, the sun is more about action, and the moon is more about emotion or introspection. You know, that there's this difference in the signatures. And often, although we could discuss this for days and days, the sun is associated with the masculine principle or animus, and the moon is associated with the feminine principle or anima. And I mean, we could get into that for a long time, but, and of course, this is in general.
Yeah.
So the idea, the solar, so we have been in for a few thousand years, like a solar culture in the West that is dominated by the idea of like a growth trajectory, and that growth equals more. You know, so more money, more crops, more wives, more whatever. You just got more. More is good, less is bad. And in some evolutionary terms, that makes sense because of a scarcity mentality when it was really hard to get stuff. But of course, nowadays it's not hard to get stuff. We can just point and click. So it's very, you know, so the whole solar impulse is really exacerbated by our modern culture, right? Because it is so easy. We have lots of disposable income. Well, some of us do. And, you know, we can get cars and all these things. So that solar
abundance all the time.
Abundance all the time, and material abundance, because the sun is generally a signature of the sun, and its online dating profile says, you know, like, I'm really into material goods, right? Yeah. Whereas the moon is like, I'm really into experiences, right? And so generally, from a depth psychology perspective, we say we live in a solar time. So gods, if you're familiar with deities, like a god like Apollo would be very purely solar, you know, about growth, civilization, structure, order. Whereas the moon gets more into that primordial, like you said, chaos, the womb, and not the womb, not in a gendered sense, but in that like subterranean, you need, all life comes from that. That's generally associated with the lunar.
Yes.
So we live in a solar time where it's like, let's grow, let's get more, let's do these things. And to go into the lunar energy of the Hecate's cave is like to balance that. So it's not, like you said, we should never like take up permanent residency in the underground, because to live there all the time is just as damaging as to always be in the solar culture. I think perhaps the best way to kind of sum up like the bad aspects of solar culture is toxic positivity. And I think
Yes.
everybody kind of knows like, oh yeah, I know toxic positivity. Like at the junior high school where my son went, which I drive by when I go into the city, the principal there is like the queen of toxic positivity billboards. So she always has these billboards, on the big sign, like that has the school name on it, and it'll be like, just turn your frown upside down.
Yeah, like it's that simple.
It's that
Yeah.
simple. And I call her the toxic positivity queen. And I when I drive by, look, what does the toxic positivity sign say now? Like, what really harmful piece of advice is she giving these like thousands of people who drive by the school, but also these young adolescents that go to her school? She's like the queen of this. Turn your frown upside down. Negative thoughts have no place in our school. It's like it's classic. But it's just so solar is good, but when it's too much, when it burns, it is that toxic positivity. It is that like hero's journey. Like we have to be moving towards something at all times, towards accomplishment, towards fame, towards selling more, doing more, getting a promotion at work. Like, and I think for me, like the lunar is like, you know what? It's time to quit.
Yeah. Like
Right? Like
let's
the
just at
lunar,
least reflect on if this
let's
is
reflect, right? Like let's reflect.
right.
And it's the end of the day, it's nighttime. And for me, something I always do when I'm done with the workday and everything I do, and the moon is out, I'm like, so I always, to me, the moon is a quitter. Like the moon, because I quit like I quit all of my obligations every night. So, and it's part of my like nighttime ritual that the
Yeah.
computer goes off, and like I'm quit tonight. Now I'm just me. And I think that like, does that sound, maybe that sounds a little bit peculiar,
No,
but it
no,
works
that
for me. Like to me, the moon is a quitter. The sun
yeah,
is like, let's get going. I'm out here demanding things from you. Be
yeah.
more, sell more. And the moon is
Gotta
like,
work, be productive, like let's go. But
yep,
yeah, I love this idea of the moon as a quitter, but there's also this other aspect of the moon, right? Like because you and I also have different cycles. Like I just spend a lot of time awake at nights. So I think that to return to this, like the idea of the solar culture versus a more lunar and reflective culture, like one of the things that I think might provide anxiety to people who grow up in a solar culture is this potential of in darkness, one, like there could be a lot of creativity, it's true, but it's also sort of dangerous. This idea of robbers come out at night. Like my dad used to often tell me, be home before the sun is down because no good things can happen outside after the sun goes down. Like who's out there? What are they doing? They're not at work. Like we don't know. And this is also you can tie this directly back to that idea of stopping to pause. Like when you're in a state of action all the time, the idea of like just stopping for a second, like just take a break, like go on vacation, take the time to reflect, have a bit of lunar time, is really potentially dangerous because of that liminality. Because it may be the case that when you stop to reflect, you might just change your mind about all this stuff. Like you might actually decide to go in a different direction. You might realize that what you've given your life to career-wise or relationship-wise is not working for you anymore. Like when you've had the time to sit with your interior, with kind of like the underworld of your soul. And so I think that there's a lot of anxiety there. But as you say, you can't spend your whole life in the underworld. You also can't spend your whole life in the state of constant aggressive growth and action without reflection. And I do think that it merits saying that in an ideal situation, like obviously these things are always moving, but what we're trying to do, and which I think like the ritual cycle does so well, is arrive at a state where we have like a negotiable equilibrium. Because when you have this equilibrium between reflection and action, that's when you can meaningfully collaborate, right? Like not even just with others, but with your own life.
Right. And I think, like you said, just so much. I'm just like, let's just hit the pause button for a second. So we all need to digest. Let's take a moment. We're going to digest that. Because it made so many awesome points. This idea of, not taking time for introspection. That's really one of the key kind of problems in our society, and it goes back to like our puritanical like origins, and this idea of like constructing a new world, and growth and business and all of those things, and those are really new ideas in the scope of the history of humanity.
Sorry, yeah.
Right. So it's not like this has always been this way, but it is like a unique kind of feature of where we are now, that we're kind of like in this hyper solar zone as a culture. But I also think like with the pandemic,
Very lunar time.
very lunar time, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
if you like me kind of see that there is like an organizing force to the world, whatever you may call it, that's so much greater than us, you can see that it was like a correction, that we were moving in a certain direction, and it was like that force in this kind of allegorical way, corrected our hyper solarness by saying, I'm going to literally send you all home, and literally bring this plague out, which is going to, kill hundreds of thousands of people and do all this damage and be really horrible. Yet at the same time, there is an arc of the universe, there is an arc of this planet that I think we largely can't understand. Getting back to Gaia, right? There is an arc of chaos and creation and destruction.
Creation wanting to trigger some chaos so that you can have different kinds of potentials. Yeah.
So not to diminish, of course, anybody's experience or the impacts of the pandemic on on the economy, on everything. But it's also like on a grand scale, a global scale, this cycle playing out. That there will always be periods where the planet goes through a period of like death and dismemberment. Like it's part of life. And because I'm not like, I don't believe in any kind of like utopian ideal, that I believe that chaos and destruction are part of the web of the universe. And the more that we consciously become lunar, consciously like talk about our fears of the dark, and the more that we consciously kind of explore the necessary energy of destruction in a non-romantic way, because I think a lot of us, when we first start out, we're called by something in the soul, something deeper, something more, to perform rituals, to explore our inner darkness. We're drawn to imagery of the dark goddess. We're drawn to these kind of death things. We don't really like have it operationalized. Like we don't have a sentence in it. Like you don't need these sentences in your mind. Like my role as an educator and an author, I need to have these ideas in my mind in order to talk about what I want to talk about. But you, as someone experiencing these things, maybe it's not necessary. You don't have to unpack why you're drawn to certain things. But it's really helpful, in terms of becoming a whole person and integrating all of your cells, because I do teach a lot of internal family systems therapy in Lymphadia as well, like getting to know all of yourselves. And I think the rebirth process is really helpful in terms of getting to know all of the pieces of yourselves that are like your table, that you're going to take so many people around the table with you through so many iterations of you, with you through rebirth, but some of them it's time to like bury them.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting, especially since we go from like the reclaiming journey and bringing back pieces of ourselves to deciding what piece of us, whether it's a relationship, an aspect of our personality, maybe it's a traumatic experience, what piece of us is finally just going to die, and we're going to stop perseverating on it, like you said, right? Because we can just get into these trauma spirals.
Yeah.
And there comes a time when we've thought about the thing enough. The thing has
Yeah.
had enough power over us for long enough, and it's time to just let it go.
Kind of like, I'm done. Yeah. But I'm really glad that you brought up COVID, because it's true, like it's created a lot of legitimate anxiety, like economically, in terms of like people who've fallen ill, like who've died, like just the fear that kind of just roves the planet for the last 3 years. And also like we have no idea how it's going to impact our minds and our bodies over the long term. Like, like children born in this time are apparently like a little bit more anxious in social situations, for example. That's going to have like a very long impact. But another thing that's happening is also like a lot of people have not been alone with themselves or with their families for this long. And there are a lot of like crucial, often quite difficult discoveries happening there. I mean, like you and I talk about this all the time, like just the stunning amount, like now that we're entering the 3rd year of this, the stunning amount of migration that's happening in people's lives, like how many people are just quitting their jobs and pivoting to something totally different, or leaving relationships, or moving out of the city and into the country, or out of the country and into the city. Like there are a lot of quite disruptive changes being made that perhaps like nobody really had the time to reflect on, or to even consider that they might want to do before. And a lot of the conversations that I've had with friends, and I'm sure that you've had the same ones, are like these quite like strange and interesting conversations about like kind of understanding what's important now, and what's not important is like showing up to work for literally 8 hours every day after a 2-hour commute. Like that's not the thing that's important. So a lot of companies are dissolving their offices as well during this time, as a result of so many people suddenly feeling that way and demanding more flexibility. And I just think like I don't think that we're even going to understand the full impacts of this maybe within our lifetimes, but it's also commonly discussed, and you and I have talked about this a lot, like pandemics do tend to disrupt things that we kind of take for granted, and we can design, like individually and also collectively, a different way to exist. This is kind of the beauty of chaos. Like when you're sprung into chaos, there's this opportunity for a new cosmos to be born, for new potentials to exist, like ways of living that you never considered. And I just think that's so powerful as we move toward this principle of the sovereign goddess and the harvest in the summer.
That's so true. And it's also like being intentional. Like we are going into the challenging, perhaps scary, chaotic nature of our interior darkness, to emerge reborn. And and to be, like you said, like there is a lot of anxiety in the world today. And I think in a hypersolar culture, we also we vilify anxiety. Like we should never feel anxiety. And one of the things, like I've been saying to people, like just people like in the community around here, when they're like, I'm really anxious about this, I'm like, as you should be. And sometimes just saying that to someone, I'm really sad, I'm quite distressed about this, whatever they say, it's like, as you should be. It would be more concerning to me, both as your friend and as a psychologist, if you weren't.
Yeah.
Like the appropriate response to this situation is to have some activation. I mean, we tend to call it anxiety. That's a very kind of like 21st century word for when we feel a little bit of like, it can be nervous excitement. We can actually be, it's like
Unease.
excited, like we're scared and excited, or
Scared.
unease.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're, like we just because like anxiety is a really popular term right now, it's kind of a catch-all for like kind of describing unease.
Yeah.
And unease plays it's an important emotion, but if we're all like, no, you should never feel anxiety, then that is like toxic positivity. It's like, how
Yeah.
do we learn to
Yeah.
explore our anxiety, to heal it, and to make anxiety like our ally? I think that's the real goal. Like, that anxiety
Yeah.
can be a healing ally.
Yeah.
Right? If we go back to Jung for a minute, the idea that the symptom is the cure.
Mm.
Right? So if we
Yeah.
go into relation with anxiety and say, why am I feeling anxious? Can I control this? Can I do some body work? Can I do breath work? Like, how can I be in company with the anxiety instead of being adversarial to the anxiety? Because I think that's another kind of toxic aspect of excessive solarness. Solarness, is that even a word? It's a word now.
Because now.
Yeah. That because everything becomes an adversary. Anything that is uncomfortable becomes an adversary. So, it's like anything that we don't like, it's like Tinder. It's like, like if you just swipe because that person caused me a little unease, I don't want to have anything to do with them. It's like complete, I don't want any unease in my life. So, I think ultimately, like, whether, you're coming in to do the rebirth journey, or you've been in this school longer and you're doing the whole cycle, or you're in Lympadia, or you're one of the kind of leaders for the experience, like a more senior student, like, just to allow yourself that kind of ability to not reject the difficult parts of yourself. Not reject anxiety, not reject your imperfections. And I think that's ultimately like what I hope as the educator we bring death to, are the things that, like perfectionism, the things that keep us from seeing ourselves as whole. It's funny when you think about it, it's like we lop off pieces of ourselves to create space, to create wholeness. And in our like kind of hoarding accumulative culture that we live in, that idea, I think, is really radical.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Marie Kondo's popularity, I think she kind of touches on that idea, like, and I think maybe that's part of why that show was so popular, because it really, like, it has a vibrancy with us. Like, it's like, yes.
Yeah. Let some things go. You're going to feel better.
Yeah, you're going to feel better if you let it go. Yeah. So we're doing this in a psychospiritual way in the school. So I thought we would end. I just want to read a quote from one of my favorite books about the goddesses. So maybe we can light our candle now. I'm going to get my lighter. Okay, so we're just going to end with a little bit of a candle ceremony, a little ritual we do, as we always do in Covina. So in this discussion about rebirth, we've talked a lot about concepts, mythology, so many things. And we just offer you, I guess, the cleansing energy to create space within your life, to seriously contemplate what rebirth might be to you. So in Covina, we do this ritual, which is we take a candle, a simple candle, and rotate it counterclockwise 3 times, and just really connect to the idea that the flame is burning away what no longer serves, in a sort of micro example of death. And then we work the candle in a clockwise manner 3 times. And that's really symbolic of protecting us and creating a container. And then we pause the candle at heart center, and we always have some kind of a blessing, something that we're filling that space that protected space we've made. So we're working with fennel this month in the school. So I offer you all the signatures of beautiful fennel, which you can read more about in my book, Entering Hecate's Garden. So fennel is all about clarity, communication. Fennel is great for releasing the ties that bind. So in terms of like what you are bringing death to, it's a great ally to have on that journey. So that's what I offer you. And let's close things with this passage from this book from the early 1970s called Lost Goddesses of Ancient Greece. It's a teeny tiny book. You can still buy it. It covers several of the Greek goddesses, and it has this most touching passage about Hecate in it. I know it's one of the favorites of my students, so I thought we would end with that today. In the dark of the moon, small covens awaited her near drooping willow trees. She appeared suddenly before them with her torch and her hounds. A nest of snakes writhed in her hair, sometimes shedding, sometimes renewing, until the new moon slit the sky. Hecate shared clues to her secrets. Those who believed understood. They saw that form was not fixed, watched human become animal, become tree, become human. They witnessed the power of her favored herbs, black poppy, smilax, mandragora, aconite. Awesome were her skills, but always Hecate taught the same lesson. Without death, there is no life. Thanks so much for watching and listening. If you're interested in experiencing the rebirth journey and you're engaged with this episode during this season, we open for new members February the 11th, which is today. And you can really join right up until mid-March. We close the gates when we get about 2 weeks before the ritual. That just gives everybody who's in this school time to prepare and really get into company with what rebirth means to them. So it'll be around about March the 15th that we close the gates. If you can't join us for rebirth, we'll open up again mid-April after the full moon in April, and you can come on board to experience all the solar fun, love, vitality of the sovereign goddesses. And you can find out information about all of this on keepingherkeys.com.